How are we doing? All right, so we are having some technical difficulties, but the good news is that David Khalil and Brad Nolan flew in on 8,000 pounds of sustainable alternative jet fuel, so we already did our first demo flight this morning, which is awesome. But as the AV people finish the setup, please talk amongst yourselves, and we're going to get started in 13 minutes. Well, yeah, punctual, thanks. welcome you all. There we go. It works. Awesome. That's actually pretty loud. It's not good to hear your own voice sometimes, too. You don't know what you sound like. Anyway, but with that said, thank you all for coming for this exciting event that's hosted and prepared by 5 associations coming together with some OEMs to prove something to happen. And with that said, Pete Bunce of Gamma is going to lead us off and say a few words. So Pete Bunce.
Well, thank you, Tim. You know, despite this weather out here, a lot of us that live and breathe in Washington, D.C. For our day jobs and everything are glad to be out of that town right now. It is just absolutely crazy. We get a chance to talk together, whether we're at NBA or the Gamma State of the Industry event or at EVA, about what's happening in those particular regions. And we focus a lot because the media is there, whether we're talking about FAA reauthorization or the new basic reg for EASA when we're over in Europe. But very seldom do we get a chance to talk about what this industry is doing globally. And I am very proud of what we collectively have been able to accomplish over the last decade. It's hard to believe that we all got together back in 2008 and sat there. We had come back from events like Paris, the Paris Air Show and Farnborough, looking at all of the displays, if you remember back, that had actually turf on some of the displays out there, and said, we better start thinking about what we're going to do as an industry on the environmental front. So in October of 2008, the manufacturers got together and said, well, we've got to really take a look at it. First of all, are we going to be able to make the same type of commitments that at that time the airlines were starting to coalesce around? Because our fleet and our refresh of aircraft and everything was totally different. And are we going to be able to come up with a standard, a global standard for CO2 emissions that applies to us in business aviation just as it would apply to the airlines? And were we going to allow the airlines to be able to dictate our future and come up with a seat mile formula or something that obviously wouldn't work for business aviation? So we had our companies take the lead. Gulfstream took the lead on being able to develop an international CO2 standard, working with all of the OEMs and our business aviation operator community to work up at ICAO, and that was a tremendously long process. Every single turbine OEM was involved in that process. And then Bombardier took the lead on being able to sit there and say, well, how do we do this? What type of commitments can we make? And one of the most incredible challenges in all that was to be able to map the fleet, to be able to look at all of the business aircraft that travel globally and try to take a look at what new production will look like, what we can do as manufacturers to improve fuel efficiency, how long those machines will still be out there, what does the retirement rate look like. So all of those processes move forward. We got together under the umbrella of IBEC, all of us together as associations, and made our environmental commitment. And back in 2008 and 2009, 2020 sounded like it was a long way off. Well, look at where we are today. And so one of our challenges, once the CO2 standard was established, was to be able to go ahead and make sure, using all of the science that was available, that every single one of our aircraft could fly with this fuel, absolutely seamlessly as a drop-in type of fuel. And then the next step was to say, once we were able to show that, we needed to advertise to all of the operators out there that this fuel was safe. And that was what we did. The natural place to do that was at EBAA, and our great partners there with EBAA in Geneva last May, we all got together and said, yes, the fuel is safe for us. But now we're at a point where we have to start talking about, okay, how are we going to get the fuel to those that want to use it, and how are we as an industry going to build the demand? And so that takes us here today at Van Nuys. We all got together and said, as we progress this whole initiative, where is a good place that we can launch this, where we have a community of operators that feels that sense inside, that responsibility, that environmental responsibility. Where is an airfield that we have a lot of activity, a lot of FBOs, we have fuel suppliers, we have a capability to be able to touch that fuel. As Tim mentioned, we had obviously Bombardier flying in with SAJF today. We had Gulfstream fly in with it. Michael said he wasn't able to fuel up because they had no availability there when he took off from New York after being on the New York Stock Exchange yesterday. By the way, Michael, congratulations. And so it is going to be our job to be able to build the demand that then drives the supply. And so that's what we are all about today, to be able to launch here at Van Nuys, to show this industry as a global industry, as all together as one, to be able to go and look at this planet and be able to say, what can we as business aviation do to meet the commitments that we made for 2020 and beyond for sustainability. So I'm very excited that all my buddies, our colleagues who are here today are OEMs, and we will have a panel of experts that can get very technical into a very complicated issue, because it is challenging to understand the science and the type of blends that you do, and so I hope that you do ask a lot of questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. I'm Gary Dempsey, president of NATA, and this is really a historical event, and we will learn a lot today. I know I will, and I want to thank every one of you for being here and making this first step with us. Einstein said there isn't anything that gets done without a first step, and that's what we're here today to do. The fact is that the person that put us all together and helped Pete and the other organizations is Tim Obitz. I want to thank you, Tim, our COO at NATA, for being brave enough to put everybody on the conference calls and lead up to this event, because it's an industry that supports each other, but we have different ideas, and that will continue, I'm sure. I've got a lot of us have seen things in the news and saw the eVTOL, electrical vertical vehicles that we're looking at in new technologies. And the fact that Pete brought up that these airplanes are already certified. Our jets that we're using today are certified. We know there's been advances in the last 10 years for their efficiencies, and now with the fuel and the supply available, this technology, this sustainable fuel model, certainly seems to make sense. And I think it has some abilities to grow and expand. If we can get everyone on board to support it, that each of you here, I hope today will do, we can make a difference, okay? The fact is, the airplane won't know that it's using the fuel, but the environment will. So that is what we're here today to do, is we have a lot of important people here. We have the fuel suppliers, World Fuel Energy, our Avfuel, World Fuel Services Corporation, a number of others here to help get that fuel and determine these questions. And I think as we participate today's panel, you'll see what it is and how we can use it and support this initiative. So with that, we're on a journey ahead. Hope you'll join us and support us. And next, I'd like to introduce the President and CEO of NBAA, Mr. Ed Bolton.
Well, thanks, Gary, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us here at Van Nuys. You know, Pete made the point that our industry is very much a global industry. I think we also want to underscore that it's a very innovative industry. It's a dedicated industry, and it's a collaborative industry. And I think you're going to see that throughout the course of today as we come together to celebrate a significant milestone in our march towards sustainability. But I also want to point out that when you are out there today for the magnificent demonstration flights, and certainly the star of the show will be the sustainable alternative jet fuel. But beyond that, you will see decades of commitment to make airplanes more efficient. You'll see it in the aircraft design. You'll see it in the materials. You'll see it in the electronics. You'll see it in the propulsion systems. Sustainability is part of our industry's DNA, just like safety and security. And so today, we're going to celebrate years and decades of effort. We're going to build on a path that has been set, and we're going to work together in a way that helps us meet a future that will serve companies and communities and countries all over the world. We are going forward toward a very bright future for business aviation. It'll be safe, it'll be secure, and it'll be sustainable. So I hope you have a good day. We're going to do a deep dive here on some technical matters this morning. We'll have the demonstration flights that I talked about, and then we'll have a very important press conference that will include some of the civic leaders that will underscore their commitment to the environment, to aviation, and to Van Nuys. So again, thank you all for being here. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to introduce the next speaker today, because he is certainly my partner and my friend and my colleague from EBAA. The Secretary General there has flown across an ocean and continent to be here and be part of this. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Attar Hussain Khan.
Well, thanks, Ed, for those very, very warm and nice words of introduction and welcoming. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. For the ones who don't know me, I grew up in the Middle East, and I remember an Arab proverb my parents used to tell me when I was a small kid, and it translates into something like, you can never turn a donkey into a racehorse. And I think what we're going to witness here today is that we're not talking about a donkey when we talk about sustainable alternative jet fuel, but we're actually already talking about a racehorse, which, if everything, needs containing more than stimulating. Having said that, welcome, and thank you all for being here today at Van Nuys Airport for what we at EBAA certainly consider to be a very special event on SAJF. It's great to see such a commitment as the partnerships across the industry, associations, companies, fuel suppliers, manufacturers, OEMs, FBOs, etc. come together, especially as we certainly believe that these are critical to the development of industry-wide initiatives like the ones that we're going to witness and discuss here today. Now, coming from Europe and to the EBAA, the SAJF project has a special place in our hearts. As the coalition of these organizations, as was mentioned by a couple of my colleagues already this morning, came together to launch the SAJF Guide at the European Business Aviation Convention and Exhibition in Geneva in May last year. And the guide will also be discussed here today. Why is that so important? Because in addition to a lot of technical and operational information, it also focuses very much on raising awareness on the adoption of available and emerging aircraft fuel sources today, as well as in the future. Now, the commitment of the coalition to continued emissions reduction is one shared across the entire business aviation sector. In fact, thanks to the continuing focus of decreasing emissions and decarbonizing the industry's footprint, business aviation today and business aircraft today are cleaner, quieter, and more fuel efficient than ever before. I'm therefore very proud to say, and representing the EBAA, that we fully endorse this initiative, will continue to do so, and thank all of my colleagues in the coalition for their commitment, drive, leadership. Also, it gives me real great pleasure and proudness to mention here today that the coalition is currently discussing to have and hold future events such as these on SAJF both in Europe as well as in the US. Having said that, I would like to thank you all once again for coming. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Excuse me. Good morning. Welcome again. I'd like to add my welcome to everybody. My name is Bruce Parry. I'm the Environment Director for the International Business Aviation Council. And what I'll be talking to you about today is the Sustainable Alternative Jet Fuel Guide, which you'll all have seen. There was one on everybody's seat this morning. I hope you've had the time to read it, inwardly digest, and you're fully conversant now with what we're talking about today. If you haven't, of course, I'd like to help you through it, raise a few key points with you and so on and so forth. And what we're going to look at here is the guide itself, an introduction, sustainable alternative jet fuel in context. We've already heard from Pete Bunce on that point, but I'll elaborate a little bit more. Why have we produced the guide? What are sustainable alternative jet fuels themselves? I won't get into really technical detail. There's some really technical boffins here. I'll do that for you a little bit later on once I've finished. Answer the questions: when can we start using SAJF? How sustainable are these fuels? We hear the word sustainable an awful lot about these fuels, but how sustainable are they in fact? And why you should use SAJF. So, as an introduction, awareness has grown about the harmful effects on the atmosphere of greenhouse gas emissions. We hear about this day in, day out more often than we did when we first started to talk about this in business aviation 10 years ago. So aviation, including business aviation itself, is a key contributor to economic growth, increased prosperity, enhancing communication, linking markets and providing economic opportunity and well-paying jobs for millions of people. So business aviation plays a very, very key role in the global marketplace today. We've already heard from Pete Bunce from Gamma this morning about the business aviation commitment on climate change. I'll get into that into a bit more detail in a second, but that's where we're coming from here today. And the good news is we've made considerable progress on that since it was put together. The single largest potential reduction in aviation's greenhouse gas emissions and the key to reaching our goals will come about through the broad adoption of sustainable alternative jet fuels in place of the current fossil-based jet fuel that we all use today. So, talking about an introduction to the SAJF guide. So increasing the industry's uptake of SJF is important, but it's clear and natural that many in the industry have questions about SAJF. You know, it's something new. It's something new to us all, and it's something that we have many questions over, and so on and so forth. And the guide itself is designed to explain, answer these questions of what SAJF is and what it's not. Its aim is to answer questions and allay many concerns that all of you, our community of operators, FBOs, owners, pilots, fuel providers, airports, and the many other stakeholders within business aviation about the performance, safety, and appropriateness of using sustainable alternative jet fuel whenever it's available, and wherever it's available. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and Pete Bunce has already mentioned, putting the SAJF into context and answers the question as to why SAJF is so important to business aviation. So the Business Aviation Commitment on Climate Change was published by IBAC and Gamma in November 2009 after a considerable amount of work of doing, understanding our industry better, what the fleet mix was, what was predicted of how we could improve the efficiency of the aircraft and improve our environmental performance. So, given it's 2009, it's the commitment itself actually celebrates its 10th anniversary this year. So many reasons to celebrate this and celebrate this important day here at Van Nuys. So the commitment itself has 3 goals and 4 key pathways, which I'll go into now, of which you'll see SAJF is a key contributor. So you'll see here, unfortunately, it's not really clear, but the third goal is to reduce the overall CO2 emissions by 50% based on 2005 by 2050. And you can see here just on the right-hand side, the big red circle. So sustainable alternative jet fuels is a very key contributor to that as part of the technology bucket that we have. So there'll be improvements in technology to the aircraft, so airframe, engine, aerodynamics, systems, and all the rest of it. But SAJF is also a new technology which is key to achieving those goals as well. So progress on each of these pillars requires action by our industry as well as other stakeholders and by governments. While progress has been uneven over the past 8 years, the aviation industry has kept its focus on improving efficiency via these pillars. And now we're beginning to see returns on that focus and so on. And the BACCC is the foundation for everything we do from an environmental and sustainable point of view, and making sure that we keep our focus on achieving those 3 goals via those 4 mechanisms in the coming years. So we have 3 goals, 4 mechanisms, and now we need to look to the future with SAJF to help us achieve the third of those goals, which is reducing our overall CO2 emissions. So how does SAJF help us meet our climate change commitments? Well, it's SAJF is a general term to describe the class of non-petroleum based fuels for blended components that are being pursued by the industry to reduce net life cycle carbon dioxide emissions from aviation operations. Enhance the sustainability of aviation by being superior to petrol-based jet fuel, environmental, social, and economic aspects. Enable drop-in fuel production from multiple feedstocks and conversion processes, which the technical guys will get into for you. I wouldn't be able to do that for you right now, but they'll do that very well later on. So in fact, there are no changes required in aircraft or engine fuel systems. That's a really important point to note. Distribution infrastructure or storage facilities don't need to be changed. They can remain as they are now today. And as such, SAJF can be mixed interchangeably or is fungible with existing jet fuel processes. So, and what we need to do is include with that an ICAO definition on SAJF, or as they term it, sustainable alternative fuels. So ICAO say that a drop-in fuel obtained from sources other than petroleum, such as coal, natural gas, biomass, hydrogenated fats and oils, has the potential to be sustainably produced and to generate lower carbon emissions than conventional aviation fuel on a life cycle basis. So I'll get onto the life cycle basis in a second, but it's very important to remember that the benefits come from not just using the fuel itself, but the way it's manufactured, transported, and so on and so forth. So what are sustainable aviation jet fuels? Well, SAJF must have the same qualities and characteristics as conventional jet fuel in order to substitute it. So there's no separation in how it's done, it's all put together. It's important to ensure that manufacturers do not have to redesign engines of aircraft, and that fuel suppliers and airports do not have to build new fuel delivery systems, and safety isn't compromised. SAJF is a non-conventional fuel and may be derived from many sources whose chemical constituents can be converted to a set of pure hydrocarbons that comprise of jet fuel. Feedstocks for SAJF are varied, ranging from cooking oils, plant oils, solid municipal waste or trash, waste gases, sugars, purpose-grown biomass, and agricultural residues, amongst others. So when can we start using SAJF? Well, we've already heard that it's been used today to fly Fly Bombardier's participants down here today, and that Gulfstream and so on have been using it in their demonstration fleets for some time. So progress on developing sustainable fuels has been moderate. It wouldn't be fair to say that it's been exceptional, but has been ongoing for the last decade and is accelerating. Technical barriers to the production of SAJF have been overcome. We'll hear more about that later on. There are now 5 different pathways approved by the aviation industry and that can gain certification. They're available to producers to convert different feedstocks into jet fuel itself. Up to this point, there's been a lack of commercial style investment that would make the deployment and commercialization of SAJF a mainstream occurrence in the near term. And that would explain really why it's been slow to market and so on and so forth. Currently, the ability for general and business aviation to use SAJF is limited due to production, lack of infrastructure, lack of understanding and economics. And that's why we're here today, and that's why the guide is so important to supporting this program as we go forward. Oh, wrong button. There we go. So despite all this, the use of SAJF by aviation worldwide is growing, with more than 100,000 flights already flown on a blend of sustainable and conventional jet fuel, and with OEMs, airlines and others undertaking numerous demonstration flights. And this has been going on for some 10 or so years, as was mentioned earlier. SAJF is supplied to and routinely used already at several global airports, including here in Los Angeles at LAX, in Norway at Oslo and Bergen, Stockholm in Sweden, and now Brisbane in Australia. And there are more airports that intend to come on stream in the coming years. So we've already asked the question, how sustainable are these fuels? Well, hopefully I can answer this one now. So relative to fossil fuels, sustainably produced unconventional jet fuels result in a net reduction in carbon dioxide emissions across the life cycle. This means that even when you take into consideration the CO2 emissions generated during the production of the SAJF, from the equipment used to grow crops, transport and raw material, refining the fuel, distributing it, and the use of SAJF has been shown to provide significant reductions in overall CO2 life cycle emissions compared to conventional fossil fuels. The industry has been predominantly focused on fuels that provide more than 50% reductions, but it's not uncommon to see approaches that achieve up to 80% reductions. So that's quite considerable, and you can see how those sorts of numbers play into contributing to an overall reduction in the sector's emissions. So why should you use SAJF? What's in it for your company's bottom line? There are several concrete benefits from the use of SAJF. First of all, given the higher energy mass density of the currently approved paraffinic types of alternatives, and depending on several factors, SAJF can be slightly more efficient than conventional Jet A1 and Jet A for a given mission. In addition, for some of the largest business aviation operators, the implementation of CORSIA, which is the new ICAO CO2 reduction scheme for international aviation, will see benefits from their international operations globally from 2020, where they'll receive benefits and incentives to use SAJF, which will lower their CORSIA requirements. So in conclusion, and last but not least, the use of SAJF may contribute to the achievement of your own company's corporate social responsibility objectives, and also what we all need to remember, that in the end, the business aviation industry must demonstrate that it remains a responsible steward of the environment if it's to preserve its ability and to grow and to fend off onerous regulatory and other legislative measures that might constrain such growth. So that really, what we're saying there is that we need to be out front rather than behind, so that we can implement these things and our overall environmental impact is lowered. And SAJF will contribute to that. Thank you very much. Now here's an opportunity for you to ask some questions. I think we have some time to do that, so if anybody has a question. Do we have a roving microphone or anything? Yeah, good. Anybody have any questions? No, good. There's one right here.
Production level, how much is being produced right now?
That I'll leave to our technical experts in the next session. They'll be able to answer that one for you. Can't see anybody else have a...
You wanted an industry-wide 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by when?
2050.
2050.
2050, yeah. Commercial aviation has a similar goal too.
Mr. Lano van Marter from Neste. When will you have this kind of demonstration in Europe?
That's under discussion at the moment, but watch this space. It's going to happen very, very soon. Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning. Tim Obitz, ATA, and I would be remiss, although Gary touted that I'm somehow a wonderful human being, but this actually event came through the brain of David Khalil and Bombardier of working with the associations to make this happen. So I just want to set the record straight on that front. But with that said, if I could have my panelists come up front, and we're going to do a panel. Proceed. With that said, we're going to go quickly through who the panelists are. You all have a media kit in front of you that talks about how wonderful and smart these people are, so I won't bore you with the detail. But with that said, sorry, Keith, I just jumped over you. We've got Keith Sawyer from Avfuel, Steve Dramala from World Fuel Services, Brad Nolan from Bombardier, Charles Etter from Gulfstream, Steve Zonka from CAFE, Tim Cesarek from GEVO, and last but not least, Brian Sherbakow from World Energy. So with that said, we're going to start a little bit and talk about, in a panel discussion, if you have questions that you'd like to have answered, feel free to jump in and raise your hand. Just don't heckle us, and we'd be all set there. But with that said, we're going to ask Brad Nolan first to talk a little bit about and explain why is SAJF important to the industry itself. So, Brad?
Thanks so much, Tim. So, can you guys hear me all right? No?
Nope.
Hello? Hello?
There we go.
We're good now. Thank you. Yeah, so I think we've covered a little bit of that, Tim, and I'll talk a little bit about, you know, from a Bombardier perspective, and Pete, you alluded to it, this idea that, you know, commercial aviation moved first 2008, making a declaration, and because business aircraft at Bombardier had a actual commercial division, we were able to support the industry with Pete and Ed to you know, all of us together to sign the declaration in 2009. And in 2009, we set very, you know, aggressive targets at that time. And Bruce, thank you for walking through those. So funny though, I remember at the time, you know, if you roll back to 2009, there were skeptics that basically were looking at this and they were saying, well, not only would it be difficult to meet, but there was a different camp altogether that were saying, well, you know, civil aviation, 2% of overall man-made emissions, that's all of civil aviation, and business aircraft, just a tiny little sliver of that 2%. So why do we even need to do this? Well, I'm certainly glad that we started early, because if you fast forward to 2018, and again, looking at this from a Bombardier perspective, where we have a whole different division working on trains, we're seeing how quickly the whole world is moving towards electrification. It's kind of my second point, I think, is that the automotive manufacturers, the bus guys, even the boat guys, moving towards electrification. And I think that that's going to shape really how potential business aircraft customers are looking at us going forward. So while a lot of the rest of the people in the pie, the CO2 emissions, have this opportunity to electrify and dramatically reduce CO2 emissions from that standpoint, aviation is a little bit different. Aviation, particularly for long-range aircraft that are you know, the largest consumers of the fuel, electrification is going to be a large challenge. So if you have 1 pound of jet fuel, it represents about 50 pounds of the energy from 1 pound of jet fuel would be the energy coming from 50 pounds of battery using, you know, today's technology. Doesn't really matter in a bus, doesn't really matter in a car. In an airplane, in anything that's floating, that's going to be a real challenge. Not as much of a problem on the short hop vehicles, but on a Learjet, a Challenger, a Global, a large Gulfstream airplane, solving that problem of getting away from fuels with batteries is going to be a challenge for, you know, the near and medium term. So looking at that then, I guess the next thing we would ask ourselves, and it was on the chart that Bruce showed, will more efficient engines and will more efficient wings solve the problem for us and enable us to meet the goal? And we have a lot to be proud of from that standpoint. 2018, what an incredible year. More efficient products being tabled by almost all the manufacturers in the industry. In particular, Bombardier with the Global 7500, which is the largest aircraft in the industry, but actually burns less fuel than the aircraft that make up the bulk of the installed base today in the large category. We have a brand new product from Charles' team, the G500. It burns much less fuel than the aircraft it will replace. And next year, two, again, products from Bombardier and another product from Charles at the top of the market that burn, you know, between 10–20% less fuel than the aircraft that are in the fleet today. The problem that we have is that there's 20,000 business jets out there. And business jets on average are retiring after the 35th year or the 40th year in service. So these brand new airplanes that are burning less fuel just can't penetrate the fleet quickly enough to bring the curve down. So that's why we think we need a tech solution. We need a retrofittable solution in the sense that can affect today all 20,000 airplanes. And it sounds like a bit of a silver bullet, but it exists, and that's what SAJF is. It's applicable today to all 20,000 business jets that are flying. So it's a really important part of our plan going forward.
That's very helpful. And so I mentioned before about this coming out of the brain of David Khalil, it's the chair of the Gamma Environmental Committee. Can you just tell us where we are on the journey as a coalition of business jet users and providers and service providers, where we are?
Sure, thanks, Tim. I think Bruce alluded to it, it's early days, and I think we're kind of maybe switching from a research phase into an implementation phase with this program. So we have the fuel, we know how to produce it. The other panelists are going to speak a lot about that today. So, you know, where we are is we're really, the last 24 months is the first time where we've started to work collectively as an industry under David Khalil's leadership on the Gamma board, the environmental board, to collectively start to promote the product. The first step in that, Tim, was research. So we went out, hired a third-party consultant who spoke with not just pilots, not just maintenance people, all the stakeholders, the FBOs, the avfuel providers. And the resounding input coming back from the survey was there's an awareness challenges for sure, but even for the people who were aware of SAJF, there were perception challenges as well. So that's why we're moving on the demand side of this equation first. So we've got to get out there. We've got to explain that SAJF is ready today. We've got to explain it's a drop-in fuel. E-Base was a great hit last year, and I think today is a really important day in the journey as well.
And I think that's an important point, is that is the reason for the guide, is through the research, there were so many questions that needed to be answered. That's a true statement, right, Brad?
I would say so, for sure.
Yeah, it was actually sort of remarkable
Yeah.
what occurred. Well, for the rest of the panel, we have Brian down on the end, who's been producing sustainable alternative jet fuel for quite a while. Can you tell us why do you think it's important for business jets, adding on to what Brad's talking about, why should they be wanting sustainable alternative jet fuel?
Well, I think it was already talked about with regard to the goals on sustainability, so that would be, I would think the primary driver. I think it's really important as we recognize the contribution from the burning of fuels in terms of the environment and the growth in the industry in general that's happened and is projected into the future. It's potentially a continuing, growing contributor to that. And there was a comment made earlier that it's important to be proactive in terms of, as an industry, getting out ahead of regulators, because that's not a good outcome, to be forced to be doing something. So there's an opportunity, given that it's a nascent industry, to actually be out there and creating a pull from folks like us and other technology developers. You can then demonstrate that to potential legislation and regulators that you're already doing what's out there and what is viable. And so and putting a heavy hand on top of you really doesn't make sense. So I think from an industry, controlling your own destiny and at the same time demonstrating a commitment to sustainability would be what I would say are the primary drivers.
So Tim from GEVO. GEVO has been in the market as well, less long than World Energy. It's my understanding. I could be completely wrong, so you can slap me after the conversation. But with that said, why is GEVO in the market of producing sustainable alternative jet fuel?
Well, we're dealing with very big markets here, right? And as a result, you can begin to see on the transportation fuel side the amount of CO2 pollutants that come from transportation fuels. We also believe that there are pollutants that come from aviation fuels. And so, being in events like this, in essence, take perception and make them a reality, right? There's, keep me in check here, there's probably some 5% blend going out on these jets today. And so we see this as a significant opportunity to take plant-based carbon, which through plants themselves being able to take in CO2 and put that CO2 back into the soil as a means by which to put low carbon fuels into jet and aviation fuels.
I just got some sustainable alternative jet fuel on my hand, but luckily it was the neat product, and you know what? It doesn't smell. So there's going to be a time for you all to sniff my hand during the event. Anyway, okay, thank you. No, with that said, so this is, if you go to hockey games for the Canadians or baseball, whatever, they do the hat, whatever, figuring out which fuel is which. So we've got a Jet A neat and the blended product right up in front of us here for you all. And anybody want to guess what this one is over here? Show of hands. Now, I thought it was moonshine, personally, and we are going to be serving the neat product since it is a bio product during the cocktail party. It's a part of a special mixture. And then, so just so you know, this is Jet A, this is neat, and this is the blended product. And you know what? The neat doesn't smell. Thank God. Anyway, so with that said, we're going to move along. And so we've asked Steve Zonka, who is with CAFE, who's been at this game for a long time, to talk a little bit about the 5 pathways that Bruce talked about.
Thanks. So thought I'd touch on three elements with respect to how these fuels are made and the benefit that comes with them. And so Bruce described in words what it means to, or how we achieve a carbon reduction, a net CO2 reduction for the life cycle of the production and use of these fuels. And this chart helps some people understand that a little bit more. And I think the bottom line is the picture on the right shows we pull hydrocarbon molecules out of the ground in the form of biocrude or some other form of crude, shale oil, et cetera. It goes through a supply chain, through a refinery, and winds up at the airport. Airplane goes up and burns it and turns it into CO2 and water vapor primarily, with a few other constituents. And so we're in this constant cycle of pulling hydrocarbons out of the ground and releasing them into the atmosphere. And that's where our CO2 growth is coming from. And all transportation, actually all fuel use does the same thing. The picture on the right is the paradigm shift in that we're not pulling all of our hydrocarbons out of the ground anymore to produce fuel. As much as possible, we're looking at nature's resources to take hydrocarbons that nature is producing because plants are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering it into their material. We take that material and convert it back into the hydrocarbons that are in jet fuel. And that's the difference. So that's how we get 50, 80, in some cases negative carbon emissions out of some of these fuels, depending on the little arrows around the supply chain associated on the right-hand side. So we still are using standard energy, standard fuel for the refining process in some cases. The trucks are delivering and they're still using carbon-based fuel, so you still have some amount of emissions that are using the hydrocarbons that are coming out of the ground. But if you look at the detailed life cycle assessments of these done with very sophisticated models, looking at all aspects of what this full supply chain looks like, that's where we're getting the reduction from. And so we talked about 50, Bruce talked about some up to 80, and I want to reinforce this concept. We are working with some production pathways where we actually go negative. You say, what does that mean? That means in the production of the fuel, like in the case that Tim just mentioned, some producers actually are taking carbon, they're pulling it out of our biosphere, and they're actually sequestering it back into the soil, for instance, as a soil amendment. And there are several other ways that that's done. So it's not unreasonable when you hear some folks talking about we actually have a carbon negative fuel. Absolutely, the industry is focused on achieving at least a 50% reduction, and a lot of that is being driven by policy elements, that we get a policy support mechanism if we achieve above a certain level of reduction. So just wanted to focus on that. The result is a net reduction of additional carbon being introduced into our biosphere. That's where the benefit comes from. Next slide talks about some specific aspects of fuel. So this is not intended to be a continuing education credit course, but I will talk about fuel molecules to a degree. The kerosene or the jet fuel that we've grown up with over the last 65 years, we refer to it as a middle distillate cut. It's coming off of a refinery distillation column in the middle. It's sandwiched between diesel above it and naphtha components below. These are pure hydrocarbons, and they're hydrocarbon chains that range from about C7 to C17. And within that range, there are the kinds of molecules that you see on the right-hand side there. The top line are some paraffins, normal and isoparaffins. They're branched. Some of them are straight chain, some of them are branched, depending on how they're produced. A second family of molecules called cycloparaffins. Sometimes you can take that zipper chain and bring it back on itself, and you form some unique cyclic components. And then finally, some aromatic content. All of those characteristics, that distribution of fuel from low to high carbon numbers, as well as those particular molecules, give us all the attributes that we need for jet fuel. It makes our aircraft perform the way that they're supposed to. It gives us the safety, surety, and several other issues. So that's what we're trying to mimic. If we want to talk about creating a synthetic or an alternative fuel, we're trying to mimic what we've been using for the last 65 years. And the good news is we know how to do that. very readily. It's all done through chemistry, through standard refinery processes, et cetera, and we're doing a great job of that. So far, and on the next page I'll talk about pathways. So far we've been focused on the top group, the paraffins, primarily because with some of the readily available feedstocks and some of the easier processes to use, those are the ones that are easiest to demonstrate. This is the 5 pathways, and I'll refer you, I think it's to pages 16 and 19 in the document that you've got in front of you. So that's pooled, the text is pooled from page 19. But we've got 5 production pathways that the aviation community as a whole has approved for the production of these fuels. And so there's a Fischer-Tropsch process that was approved by the industry in 2009. Second one is a HEFA SPK approved in 2011. Third is a HFS SIP that was approved in 2012 using sugars as a starting material. We did a derivative of the first one, Fischer-Tropsch, with the addition of some aromatic content in 2014. And then finally, the approval of alcohol to jet synthetic paraffinic kerosene in 2016. And then we did an addition to that in 2018 on April 1st. And that allows for the use of butanol and ethanol as feedstocks to go into a jet fuel process. So those are the 5 pathways. The 2 manufacturers that are here today will talk about their place in that family. And I only want to make one more comment with respect to something that somebody else said about moving from R&D to production. That's absolutely the case, particularly with these pathways. But you should also know that there are about another 15 pathways that are out there that we're working with early producers on to continue to expand our ability to produce fuel from 4 families of feedstocks. Lipids that nature gives us that look really very similar to fuel. We don't have to do much with them to turn them into jet fuel. Sugars, lignocellulose, that's the body, the material that comprises trees and plants. We can convert that also. And then another one that's really burgeoning now is this concept of using hydrocarbon slipstreams from industrial processes and even pulling that CO2 out of the atmosphere itself. We've got a couple companies right now, one up in Canada, that's actually commercializing that concept, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, using several processes and converting that back to jet fuel. So the future looks bright from that perspective with respect to being able to produce these fuels worldwide, which is what we need because we're a worldwide industry, and from a very broad range of feedstocks. And the trick in all of that is getting the economics right, and that's what we're working on. Kathy's been working on this activity for about 12 years, making some great progress, and looking forward to having additional producers involved in these kinds of discussions going forward.
So thank you very much. So this is supposed to be dialogue. I'm sure you'll have burning questions to ask about the 5 pathways. Go ahead.
This is a question for Steve. Who is the company in Canada that's using fuel by pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere?
Carbon engineering. Yep.
Can you repeat the question or use the microphone?
Sure, the question was, who is the company in Canada that I referenced? And the name of the company is Carbon Engineering. And I don't want to highlight them necessarily. There are others out there, but Carbon Engineering is really making some nice progress at present.
And just so you know, we also have Lana here from Neste, who also they're producing sustainable alternative jet fuel. So if you have questions of GEVO and World Energy, Lana's here as well to talk with you all. So Charles, any other questions related? Yes, Jürgen.
Just a question, is that power to liquid like the buzzword?
Is power to liquid the buzzword?
Yeah, that's power to liquid is a broad concept of, I think here's the best way to think about it. If I go back to that jet fuel diagram on the life cycle, where I said we still have small chunks of carbon coming out of that overall process, well, the power to liquids concept is actually utilizing renewable energy for those small pieces where you can, so that you get a net reduction from using renewable, an additional net reduction from using renewable resources. So yeah, that's one good example. There are several little branches of the overall concept of power to liquids, but yes, thanks.
If you don't mind, I did have a comment.
Yep, sure, Charles.
Is this on? Hello, is this on?
Not quite yet. He'll turn it on for you.
All right, keep talking. I'll keep talking. How's that?
That was good. I was actually going to ask you to talk right now, so this works out well.
Any better, any better, any better? All right, let's try this one. I guess I got the one mic that's more interesting, more challenging, right? So in addition to what Steve mentions about the annexes and the pathways, and that's, as he said, it's on the brochure there, I wanted to make sure everybody understood that there is a process in order to get to that annex, and that process is a very robust process. It's spelled out in ASTM D4054, and the manufacturers, OEMs, and so forth are involved in that process. It's not an easy process. Some of the early ones, Steve, took years, I think, to get through that in order to have an approved fuel. And once that pathway, I should say, once that pathway was approved, it turns up in this annex here in ASTM D7566, and then it becomes approved for jet aircraft immediately, essentially, as 1655, ASTM D1655. So I just want to make sure you understand that it's not an easy method to get into that annex, and it's very well controlled. Lots of tests, different types of tests, specification properties, fit-for-purpose tests. There's something called a Tier 3, which is component and rig tests. Then they do some full-up engine or APU tests. There needs to be a research report that comes out of this. This research report is reviewed again by various OEMs. There is a process where the FAA also has to review that. Then there is a voting process, a balloting process, and it has to be accepted by this group. So it's not easy to get through this. Once it does, this is Jet A, and there is a mixing limit. For instance, it may be 50%, like our HEFA jet fuel that we use. So there is a percentage blend that is a maximum of that, and that's how that thing is certified. That's how that pathway is certified.
Charles, could you talk a little bit about why the recycled nature of the process is so important?
Yes, I can. So first of all, I'd like to say I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for coming and enjoying this education. This is about education and stewardship. These are the kind of the two words that I would be using to talk about this: is stewardship and educating today. And it just so happens, and I wish everybody had this, because you probably can't see it, but you can probably see there's a symbol there, right? That's recycling symbol. You know what it says? It happens to say, made with 50% recycling plastic. And below it, it says, proof recycling works. Now, I didn't stage this, but guess what? That's pretty close. The HEFA fuel is good for up to 50%, so you could blend it in the same way. So plastic, in this case, when I finish this, I'm going to go put it in a recycle bin, right? And it's going to stay in this closed loop system, which is what Steve just said. So that's the point of SAJF, right? What are you recycling? You're recycling carbon molecules. You're emitting them, they're in the biosphere, they're being absorbed and used in some way. Or you're using waste, right? Steve mentioned municipal waste, for instance. You're using some form of waste and you're putting it back in the recycle bin, wherever the recycle bin is, and it's going to be reused. And that's the difference between conventional jet fuel, crude-based, petroleum-based, and SAJF. And that's the importance of it. And to me, that's the exciting portion of it. So when you burn that fuel, whatever portion that is on that flight, or whatever you purchased, that came from within the biosphere and is being recycled. And that little symbol right there on the recycling is an important part of this discussion.
So one thing that we talked about in prepping for this panel was an important point. And so once it's certified, coming out of World Energy and GEVO, for the rest of you, what is it? After it's been blended and certified, what is it? It's not a trick question. It's jet fuel.
It's jet fuel.
Exactly. So it's the chemical equivalent, and there ain't no difference. And that was the toughest part in creating the guide, was dealing with that issue. Because people would say, but it's sustainable alternative jet fuel. No, it's Jet A. Yep. Well, thank you. Well, with that said, we're excited to have GEVO and World Energy here. I'm actually pumped about that. I'm also from California, so I do California jargon. And so we're going to have Tim talk a little bit about the GEVO process. And so we have a slide for Tim.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here today. This is exciting to see people so committed to sustainable jet fuel. Our pathway, to reference what Steve was mentioning earlier, is an alcohol-to-jet pathway. We are certified by the ASTM. We can blend up to 50%. We are agnostic to the feedstocks that we use that are plant-based carbons. They are carbohydrates, meaning sugars. So what we do is we take that plant-based carbon. From that plant-based carbon, we separate and fractionate that plant-based carbon into, in the first instance today, we take non-edible low-carbon corn. We fractionate that into protein. We fractionate that into corn oil. And the remaining portion are the starches. Those starches have sugars. Those sugars are rich in building blocks to make sustainable jet fuel. For example, for every gallon of jet fuel we make, we produce about 10 pounds of protein. That protein is used to feed us all. We put about 2 pounds of carbon back into the soil. Photosynthesis is exceptionally efficient. Taking CO2 out of the air, putting it into this plant itself to make the sugars, to make the lignocellulosic walls, and to put carbon back into the soil. Once we get to that alcohol, the alcohol we make is not ethanol. It's not like vodka we drink. It's an isobutanol. That isobutanol is a 4-carbon molecule, not a 2-carbon molecule like ethanol. This makes it much more efficient for us to build carbon-on-carbon molecules to make jet fuel, which, as Steve referenced, can have much higher carbons associated with them in that mix. In addition to that, what we are also learning as we grow, as we expand, it's not only about the plant circularity, that element of being able to take carbon in, it's also about the business system you employ. So what we do is we look to find opportunities where, frankly, we can take our direct production process off the grid, where we're not using natural gas as a fuel source, where we're not using coal-based electricity to produce the electricity we need for the plant. So we do this to drive carbon completely out of the system. And in fact, to Steve's point, there are some sources of energy that we can take in, like biogas, for example, that have negative carbon footprints that in essence lower the overall carbon intensity of the process from, in our instance, low carbon corn that farmers are utilizing exceptionally sustainable practices to ultimately produce, to ultimately the jet. And so, again, it's not just about the feedstock itself, it's about how you convert that feedstock into a low carbon fuel. Once we get to that isobutanol, we utilize traditional chemistry. We take water out of the alcohol. Now we have an isobutylene, which is used in refining today. And then we build carbon molecule onto carbon molecule using existing refining processes to do so. So that's what we do. That's how we do it.
Great. And there was a discussion where Steve and Charles were talking a little bit about the approval process. What was that like for GEVO to get?
No, don't ask him.
Okay. All right.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah. Don't skip it.
Go ahead. The only reason I say that, give Tim the shot, right? So GEVO's got stripes on their back. One of the companies that it took an inordinately longer period of time and at fairly great expense. And what I'm happy to report is that I think the industry learned a lot of lessons in that exercise, and we've done several things going forward to try to make that process move much better. And some of those are actually happening right now. We've got some ballot activity going on in ASTM. But Tim, go ahead.
It took several years.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, because we get questions a lot about, well, hey, why can't these people just produce the stuff right away? And that was the point I was trying to make. Any questions for GEVO? Leo Knappen.
I have Tim, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, both Tims, I guess.
And your name, sir? Leo?
Leo Knapp.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Good to meet you. How many gallons do you produce at this time? What's
Sure.
the production rate, and how do you go up and down, and how can you modify your production rate to meet demand? I'm just curious about
Right,
that.
right. Well, right now, we've just, we're at a facility that takes the isobutanol from our plant in Laverne, and we have a plant in Silsbee, Texas right now that's producing about 100,000 gallons of hydrocarbons, jet fuel associated with that. We're looking to expand. We would say by 2021, 2022, we'll be making about 12 to 15 million gallons of hydrocarbons. That is a process, right? We can talk about that further as we think about what are some of the constraints to the industry, right? It's being able to get to and build capacity, and you need money to do that, and you need capital to do that, and we're embarking on that. To give you a sense of the flexibility in the process, we have the ability, one of the co-products that we make in our process is a product called isooctane, which is about 80 to 90% of gasoline. So we, in effect, not only make a drop-in jet fuel, but we make a drop-in gasoline. This does a number of unique things in our process in the sense that we can really treat our process like a biorefinery in the sense that we can make those distillate cuts in our process, not from boiling oil like you would in refining, but through traditional chemistry, okay? So we have flexibility to produce more jet and flexibility to make more isooctane. To be blunt with you, it depends upon what the market's willing to pay for isooctane versus what they're willing to pay for sustainable jet fuel. That, from our shareholders' perspective, allows us to think about where we operate our plant and how much jet fuel we put in the market versus how much renewable gasoline we put in the market.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes.
So, Tim,
Yep.
I feel like I could listen to your presentation 5 more times to really understand it. But
Sorry about that.
no, I mean, it's very complex. So you alluded to using municipal solid waste as a potential feedstock. Is there?
No. So we today, right, we utilize a carbohydrate or a starch, a sugar. Think of things that are made in bread, right? You've got starches in bread. You've got sugars in bread. That today is coming from a non-edible corn, okay? Like I said, we fractionate that corn into protein, right? That protein goes to animals to feed that we ultimately can have proteins in our meat, proteins in our milk, from dairy cows, et cetera, right? It is the remaining starch portion after we fractionate the protein and the corn oils that go to feed people that we utilize to ferment, okay? Just like if you were to, do you like vodka?
Who doesn't?
All right. So in processes of making vodka, they utilize carbohydrates, sugars in some instances, potatoes in some instances, wheat. These are all things that can be fermented, right, into making alcohol, all right? And so, but we don't make ethanol, which is the alcohol you drink, right? We make isobutanol, which is a higher order carbon molecule, right? If you drink scotch, I don't know if you drink scotch, but the aroma you get from isobutanol is that aroma you would have in scotch. There's some isobutanol smells. There are some butenes that come in scotch that ultimately you have as a smell. So, did I help you there?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
I guess maybe my question is there an opportunity to use municipal
Sure,
solid
of course
waste?
there is.
Because we've got this big waste
yeah.
diversion requirement with
Yeah.
Assembly Bill 1826.
So roughly, I would say in the U.S., there's probably 50% of the municipal solid waste stream today is made up of organic fractions of waste, right? That can be food waste, that can be grass, it can be trees, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, we don't care where those carbohydrates come from. It's a matter of the cost of those carbohydrates, because we want to pass on the best value to the folks that want to buy the jet fuel, right? And so one has to be thoughtful of how does one get those carbohydrates out of those waste streams in an efficient manner to then be able to ferment. Sure, you can ferment grass, you can ferment food waste, you can ferment all those things and make isobutanol or alcohols from that as well. Again, the question becomes around cost and availability and I would say the overall supply of those materials, right? If you think about it, billions of gallons of jet fuel are consumed on an annual basis, right? So if we really want to make the kind of strides that we've set forth for our goals, we have to have multiple sources of feedstocks that ultimately address this, right? It's not just about using municipal solid waste. It's not just about using wheat. It's not just about using seed oils. It's about a broad portfolio of carbohydrates to make a significant impact. And then let's let the market determine what's the most effective, right?
I have so many more questions, but I don't want to hog the mic, so I'm just going to find you later.
Yeah, so there's going to be time for networking and talking with Brian and Tim and Lana afterwards, where you can just pick their brains. It's going to be awesome. I'll get back to you for your question. The microphone went the wrong way, sir.
Sorry, did we want to take it
Go
back
ahead,
somewhere
Bob.
else?
Go ahead, Bob.
Good morning, everybody. Bob Hobby from Service Elements. Two questions. First one is about public relations. You know, our industry does an amazing job at times, and today is another example of doing wonderful things for our global community, for the folks that we serve. But sometimes we're challenged. So my question, Tim, I guess to you, to Gary, to Pete, and to Ed, is there some strategy? Have we given some thought to how we're going to publicize this wonderful thing that we're starting to do in our community? That's question one. Question two is much shorter. Steve and Keith, what is this going to do to the FBO business model, the traditional FBO business model?
Yeah, why don't we go with the second one? What is this going to happen to do with the FBO industry model?
Look, we'll see if we can get this one to work. But look, in my opinion, I think it's going to enhance the overall FBO model. I don't see why there would be any downside when you continue to offer alternatives out there to the flying community. You know, we'll get into some of these topics later, but obviously we have some location challenges right now when it comes to our source for alternative jet. But, you know, as the industry continues to expand, we will address those type of barriers. But, you know, maybe, Keith, you have a slightly different response here, but I really don't see any negatives at all associated with expanding this into the FBO community. Now, the education component, I do agree with you. Look, even internally within World Fuel, we've been at this for the last 3 to 4 years. It's a scalable operation for us. We have the technical expertise in-house. We have our supply and dispatch organization trained very well to distribute these products, and we do this efficiently every single day. So again, I think it's a scalable opportunity for us to embark on some new FBOs. We do get some questions every once in a while from a few out there if they have an interest or if we can supply them, and we take those very seriously, and we're continuing to do that going forward as well.
And Bob, a good illustration is the aircraft that you hear today are flying on SAJF. SAJF was delivered yesterday to this airport. It was dropped in on a seamless basis as certified 1655 jet. And we have 2 of our FBO managers here today, and there were no issues as far as, quote, the business model. I think that the issue won't be, quote, the FBO business model. It will be the business model of SAJF overall, which has 3 key components. 1, commercial scale production. 2, ultimately pricing. And then how do you set up the infrastructure to support the delivery of this product independent from your typical refinery supply chain?
Pete, please.
I'd just like to help address Bob's excellent question, and especially the first part by kind of adding on to the question, taking us a little bit out of the tactical level to the strategic level. And Steve, probably a lot for you. Our future is tied very much to our commercial brethren that burn a hell of a lot more gas than we do globally. But we have a thing that's happening globally called market-based measures that are going to come into effect very soon. So how do you all envision working at a global level with ICAO and the commitments that the entire industry has made? How do we roll the sustainable alternative jet fuels into a market-based measure approach, which will then drive demand with us in business aviation riding on the coattails of what our commercial brethren are going to do?
Steve?
So
don't want to take a huge detour into the policy arena, but the thing that hasn't been discussed here this morning is we have this pending regulation that will start to impact all commercial international operations, as well as operators of a certain size. There's some de minimis function in that regulation. The way that that has been set up so far is that a company who is obligated under that framework has to offset their growth from 2021 onward. One of the ways that they can do that is by utilizing SAJF, and the carbon reduction associated with the fuel that they burn physically reduces their obligation. All right, so it's a very direct linear translation of use of fuel to a reduction of the obligation under RFS. The second piece of that is, if fuels are not available, the industry as a whole agreed to the concept of developing a market-based mechanism that allowed aviation to buy credits from somewhere else in the world, other activities that are also engaging in carbon reduction, and use those in lieu of actually using alternative fuels or any of the improvements from the other three pillars. So, you know, from my perspective, yeah, I work on the commercial side. We clearly have been engaged with the business community as well as the military since our inception. We're really working hand in hand. I think there are a few unique dynamics with respect to the business aviation community versus the commercial side. And actually goes back to the previous question that was asked about, you know, publicizing, et cetera. On the commercial side, what we have found worldwide is a lack of interest of the flying public to pay, just generically. I think that's changing as we all become a little bit more sensitized to sustainability. But I would say that on the business aviation side, it's a different paradigm. You have institutions that are interested in corporate social responsibility goals, and they're making many other commitments throughout their operations to improve their sustainability. So I think it creates a very unique paradigm for the business aviation side of the house. On the military, the military was a huge supporter of our early work based on administration changes, et cetera. That's declined at the moment, but things are really going strong on both the commercial and business side, and I see plenty of ways for us to continue to work together to explore publicizing what we're doing, looking for this end consumer buy-in, and helping facilitate the overall development going forward.
Yeah, we will get to the first question in just a moment, Bob, that you asked. No, I'm being serious. So we have another question. A gentleman's been waiting patiently.
Just wondering, I guess for the whole panel, how important is the California's LCFS program to this today and the next 5 to 10 years? And how do you see this industry being more competitive in California versus Oregon or versus the rest of the country?
Brian.
So, first of all, let me step back for a second and also say thank you. I dove into answering the question earlier. I just want to say thank you. Today is actually a really important moment, I think, in the progress of what's going on with alternative jet fuels in general. And I'll give you a little bit of a framework to contextualize that. Back when I first got involved in this, when our company started our development path, it was back in 2008. We were born out of a military funded project, a DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project, to demonstrate the viability of alternative jet fuel. And it was a far lonelier place to be doing it at that time. There was no ASTM pathway whatsoever back in 2008. There were a very small number of companies, OEMs, associations, agencies, et cetera, associated with it. So I'm really encouraged and excited to actually sit in a room with a bunch of new faces, and in fact, not just the commercial aviation side, but the general aviation side. It's really actually exciting. And I'll get to why I think that's really important, and I'll also answer the PR question a little bit in just a moment. But back in 2008, the impetus was really about national security, and it was being driven by the military. And actually, the very first ASTM pathway was primarily driven from that perspective, and it really wasn't environmentally driven. The companies and the technologies being worked on at that point were from coal, and trying to convert coal using Fischer-Tropsch technology
to renewable jet fuels. Quickly thereafter, we moved into our project, which was using fats, oils, and greases, and it was moving and morphing more into an environmentally driven activity than national security, but attacking or addressing both of those items. But earlier I was asked the question as to why the general aviation industry should be interested in using this. I'd like to twist that just slightly and say why the general aviation community should be telling folks why they want to use it. And that's really important because we need advocacy really badly. Because so much of what we're doing here, and I don't want to slip into the slippery slope of too much policy, we'll go there as you direct us, but policy is really what has been driving this and what's going to continue to drive it and accelerate that going forward. So having more folks explaining to regulators, legislators, users, customers, et cetera, of this, gets more voices out there, gets more policy, gets ultimately more money going into this, and ultimately we'll get more expansion of production and ability to use this. So it's really critical that this group here today is understanding, embracing, and now becoming advocates for this. And as you go back into your communities, it's really important to talk about what you learned here and get people engaged, open their minds to understand that this is available as a solution and impact those folks who can impact policy.
And that's also part of the next steps of the coalition, is that we are working together to educate. So this is a process to educate not only the public, but also the policymakers. So Capitol Hill, we've already had some meetings up there. They're very interested. And we'll talk about that later on in the process. But this is the first step, obviously, was signing of the declaration back in 2008. Then going fast forward to eBase and the guide, and now here today. And it's like we're pushing a snowball. And the snowball is getting bigger and bigger. And this is very, very exciting. And so I was asking Attar to come up. You can come up here, Attar, and talk a little bit about answering your first question.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks for the question. It's a great question. Let me try to just put a little bit of a European perspective to this. What we're seeing in Europe, not necessarily the European Union, but Europe, is this incredible plethora of initiatives at political level of increasing taxes on the aviation industry. It's sold as a poverty tax, it's sold as an environmental tax, it's sold as a tourist tax, whatever it is. Fact is that the unit costs on the industry are raised consistently and constantly under the, let's say, excuse umbrella of it's good for the environment. Narrative behind it, thinking that we can organize society in such a way by making travel so expensive that the demand will decrease, hence that's good for the environment. I think that's completely the wrong way around. It's certainly not the way that EBA is approaching this. What I sometimes find a bit concerning, including in the discussion that we're having here today, is that we're constantly talking about a license to grow, as if the status quo we have today is a given. I can assure you it's not. It's about a license to exist. If we do not come up as industry with leadership in dealing with our carbon footprint, dealing with our noise footprint, the regulators, as a number of panelists has already said today, are going to do it for us, which is not where we want to be. One of the narratives that we're using as EBAA, and I'm saying this in almost every panel I am in all over the world, talking to the media, talking to what we call the Brussels Hill, with regulators, politicians, etc., is that the business aviation community is a very adaptable industry, it's very flexible, it's very innovative, and it's very forward-driven. Hence, we're not part of the problem, we are actually part of the solution. Can we do a better job as a coalition on SAJF in getting that narrative across? In all frankness, I think we can. And that's why events such as these are so great, because it gets us together as coalition partners with all our partners around us. It gets us together with the media, hopefully one or two regulators as well, to get that message across. Can we coordinate that more closely? I actually do believe, and certainly from EBA's perspective, I would be very glad to lead that when we move into having events like these on the other side of the Atlantic as well. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, I want to actually, it can't be any better said than that. That was awesome. Thank you. I wanted to clap when you finished. It was like, boom, drop the mic. Go ahead, Brian.
This is on again. I actually didn't get to answer the actual question about LCFS in California and the importance of it.
Yes.
So if you indulge me just a second, I'd like to actually address that. And it's a compliment to what I was getting at with regard to advocacy. Because the LCFS program here in California, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program, which essentially, for those who aren't aware of it, puts a price on carbon. And as a result of doing that, when we produce a unit of fuel, we're able to monetize that carbon reduction that we create relative to the petroleum counterpart. And so that creates incentives and it allows us to monetize it and ultimately reduce our cost of our product to our customers. So it's a really important piece of policy. But when I talk about advocacy, one of the themes that you need to keep in mind is when you talk to folks who are going to put various policies in place, one of the learnings we've had over the last several years in biofuels in general is you need to be thinking not narrowly but widely about what potential fuels could be out there and try to be agnostic and try to treat all fuels equally. So early on, when we started our venture here in renewable aviation fuels, when we looked at various policies and various legislators, nobody knew about aviation fuel. They were solely focused on ground transportation fuels. So much of the policy that we're living within today ignored it. And so as a result, there's a lot of uneven incentives in the marketplace for renewable fuels that disincentivize aviation fuel production relative to diesel as an example. And one of the major breakthroughs that's very exciting that just happened starting January 1 of this year is that aviation fuel is now an opt-in or it's a qualifying product within the California program. So we can now monetize carbon in California for aviation fuel, which is a huge step in making it more cost competitive, incentivizing producers to go and make jet versus diesel. Many of the technologies out there have that optionality. And as we're running our facilities, we've got a fiduciary responsibility to make as much margin as possible for our investors. And if we can make more money doing diesel, we're going to have to do that to the degree we can't bridge that gap. And so just as an example of how important LCFS is, today a credit is worth well over $1 a gallon. And so when you didn't have that, you certainly couldn't make jet as much as you would want to unless somebody was willing to bridge that. And to their credit, there have been industry pioneers and leaders that have been willing to do that to help get us to that next level. And I tip my hat to our friends here, the folks at Gulfstream, the folks at Bombardier, who have been willing to pay those differentials, to help us get to a point, to be able to drive policy, to close those gaps, et cetera. So there are folks, but that's not a sustainable business model for them, and it's not a sustainable business model for producers to have to rely upon that. So that's even policy is a really critical message.
May I build on that?
Yeah, of course. Go.
Thank you. And just one more comment to add, which is and you're welcome to pile on to this comment, but the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard is now, in many respects, becoming a framework for other states piling on and saying, hey, that was good policy. This is a way to be able to create value for us for carbon. So Washington, Oregon, there's discussions about a Midwest low carbon fuel standard. These are all things where, because of this policy, it's starting to create a level playing field that ultimately is creating the incentive for us as producers to say, okay, now, yeah, let's not make more gasoline or diesel, let's make more jet fuel, because there's an economic incentive to do so.
Just one last comment about that. It's sort of a tricky thing to walk, fine line, because we, as producers or potential producers, don't want to go to policymakers in any way suggest that they come in with legislation that's requiring the industry to do something. We understand our customers would not be very happy with us. So we try to figure out ways in which to have it as an opt-in. One of the interesting elements of aviation fuel relative to ground transportation fuels is who has the authority over the fuel. So when we went, for instance, to the state of California to work within their program, they actually don't regulate the fuel. So we had to bring in our friends at the FAA to come in and essentially say that they were going to support this fuel being part of this program. So there's a coordination that has to happen to make this policy effective.
Charles?
Actually, I have a question as well for Brian. And it's a very good question out there about the LCFS here in California. So my question to Brian is, if it's purchased, it's very good that this is here. Is it purchased here, does it also have to be burned within the state, or do you have to deliver it within the state? Is it within the state only, or is it outside of that?
So the answer is it needs to be delivered into the wing inside the state. You don't need to fly within, over the state.
No, I wasn't going there. Just where do you deliver it? You deliver it to New Mexico and you get the same, I don't know.
So again, the delivery point has to be within the state, and then it can, and we've been delivering fuel now for several years to international carriers, as an example, who we put it into the wing, and they're flying overseas, and we're still able to monetize the credit, or be eligible for such a thing, so.
Yeah, a lot of questions here. Go ahead, sir. Hi, I'm Wayne Williams. I'm with the Van Nuys Airport Citizens Advisory Council, and I thank you very much for coming to our airport, and I thank you and honor you all for your efforts to make this progress and to head in this direction even without significant legislation or requirements. I have a couple of questions. One, is SAJF available to go 100% in an aircraft, or does it need to always be blended with some form of petrofuel? And the other is, are petrofuels that make Avjet essentially fuel subsidized in some way? And if those subsidies were diminished and the funding available to tax credits, et cetera, going to your biofuel systems, going to incentivize and move us faster towards converting the industry to alternative fuels much faster. I'm really curious as to what it takes and what you think could expedite this. And I reference this because the United Nations just came out with their report that says we have 12 years to get our act together, not till 2050. So we're all kind of anxious and paying attention to this and assuming that the system or the government in DC is going to change hopefully soon enough and get us back on track. So I'm curious on your thoughts. Thank you.
Steve, could you? Yeah, I'll take the first part of your question 100%. So the answer is yes, absolutely. And in fact, we're expecting an additional annex to be qualified in the first half of this year with a technology that also uses lipids. And the difference being is that, back to my chart of those molecules, that production pathway actually produces all of those molecules, not just the paraffins that some of the pathways that are approved today do. So although the initial annex in 7566 will likely still limit that fuel to 50% max, it's because the industry is interested in seeing multiple producers come forward, seeing their quality control, run rates, et cetera, to give the industry confidence that yes, these guys have their processes in control, they're using good quality management practices, et cetera, and then they can come back and look for higher levels of approval. The proof in the pudding in that case is the Navy has already used that fuel at 100% level. Now, there's one caveat to that. So one of the drivers for limiting to 50% today is we need aromatic compounds in our fuel, in legacy products, to maintain seal swell in the fuel systems, all right? So if you don't have aromatic content in your fuel, the seals shrink and you wind up with drippage, leakage. You can. It's not guaranteed that that will happen. But that's one of the primary drivers, that we set a 50% limit to ensure we still had some level of paraffinic content or aromatic content in the fuel. And then there's a lot of technical details about how you wind up with a 50% to start with. But the answer to your question fundamentally is yes, we do expect to see fuels at higher blend rates and fully synthetic fuels in the future.
Thank you. So moving on the issue as well. So part of it too is on the policy side is we are trying to even the playing field between sustainable alternative jet fuel and biodiesel. So we have the consumers out there. We've got corporations demanding the stuff. We have individuals demanding the stuff. We're begging for the stuff to happen. but there isn't a real reason in my mind, for the refiners to give it to us, because they've got a niche with biodiesel. Would that be a fair statement, Brian and Tim? Or am I way off?
In some cases. So take a slight different twist on it. First of all, it's not just biodiesel. There's now renewable diesel. And there's a big differentiation. It's important. Our company does both. They're both important, but we keep evolving. Stepping back for a second, just a high-level thought, and again, trying to frame things. Everyone now understands and is aware of what's going on. We're hearing more and more the message of urgency, so that's a really good thing. But we've really, in this go, had about a decade of real effort going on. So we need to be relatively realistic and patient about where our progress is. And I think we're escalating within the speed in which we're finding newer solutions, and that's a good thing. Remember, at the beginning part of this 10 years, we had 2008 happen, and so the whole world stopped in terms of financing, banking, and the ability to go access capital. We're coming out of that, and it's a little bit better. Some of our policy is uneven at the federal level in terms of incentivizing us, but it's better. So we need to be a little bit patient. With regard to the 100% fuel, that's an example. Earlier, when you brought the fuels up and you said you couldn't smell one of them, that's probably a HEFA product, I'm suspecting, and that's the neat, and it doesn't have aromatics in it, as an example. And aromatics is that smell. We don't have it. And so that's why our particular pathway, our ASTM pathway, requires us to blend 50% or more to be able to get the aromatics into that product, to get that seal swell, et cetera. But with more work and more R&D that will happen, you'll get different components from different technologies where we'll be able to go and instead of having to buy petroleum Jet A to blend with, we can just go buy a renewable aromatic and put that into our fuel, and we'll have a new path and we'll have 100%. So there, again, it's an evolutionary thing. Back to the biodiesel and the renewable diesel. It's actually, I think, a really exciting moment, because renewable diesel is actually a pure hydrocarbon product itself. And I mentioned earlier, we as manufacturers, as refiners, have options. We can actually, within our diesel pool, distill out jet from within that. Or we can crack diesel to make it shorter to make jet. We have options if the market's telling us that's what we should do. So what's exciting is renewable diesel production is increasing significantly right now. World Energy has put in a couple $100 million to date. We just announced another $350 to $400 million of investment that's happening here in California into our refinery. I'll talk more about what that means for our volumetrics for jet specifically, but more importantly, we have folks like our friends at Neste in the audience here who also recently made an announcement about additional investments into their refining capacity, which is already very significant at their facilities in Singapore, in Finland, and over in Rotterdam as well, in the Netherlands. We also have manufacturing capacity in renewable diesel in the Gulf, Diamond Green Diesel, Renewable Energy Group, and there are other folks in the audience here today who are looking at also putting in new additional renewable diesel capacity. It's not a far stretch to take some of that capacity and convert it into aviation fuel. Again, it's going to be policy driven to determine whether you want that molecule to be manipulated into an aviation molecule versus a road transportation fuel. So we've got an installed base that we could have a tipping point in having much more available product into the marketplace in relative short order. So I don't know if that's directly answering the question.
That helps a lot, and moving it along, because World Energy, this is not the Brian show right now, but I'm going to ask you another question because that's where we are in the progression of my beautiful chart up here I have to follow, and that is talking about the fuel that's being used today at Clay Lacy and Jet Aviation. Go ahead, Brian. With the
talking about it in regards to which aspect, please?
Yeah, talking through the World Energy fuel that's being pumped out today by the FBOs.
Well, I mean, I'll talk about it. You can kick me in a different direction, or we can talk about our friends over at World Fuel Services can talk about it as well. But I guess what I would comment on that is, and to steal a phrase from former Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, who made a comment when he launched what he called his Great Green Fleet to demonstrate renewable military fuels that we participated in. This is a new normal. And what that means is if you take a look at that truck there when it says Jet A on the back of it, and per the comments that were made earlier regarding the ASTM pathways, at the end of that process, this fuel is Jet A. It is 100% deemed, handled, utilized as Jet A. And so it's fungible. So when we go into FBOs, it should be treated and utilized and handled as you would Jet A. I'll give you an example. We've for now, to date, 3 years of going into LAX. We don't go into discrete tankage. We don't have discrete infrastructure whatsoever. It's going into the common fuel farm there. And so if you fly out this week out of LAX, you're going to have some of our molecules. It might be one in your plane, but there'll be molecules going off through the hydrant system into all of the wings. And that's an efficiency that's really important to us. It shouldn't be different. It is a new normal. So with regard to the FBOs, we think it's an incredibly exciting opportunity from a awareness opportunity, but from an operations perspective, we think that it should be, with all respect, a bit of a yawn, because frankly, it's really not any different than what's happening today.
So with regard to production capacity, you're producing renewable diesel as well as a sustainable alternative jet fuel. How much fuel are you producing now of the SAJF?
Sure. So our refining capacity installed that came online late 2015 is approximately 40 million gallons a year. And we have the ability to make half of that into neat renewable jet fuel. We don't, because again, the policy isn't aligned to incentivize us to do that. So we make more margin by making some of our other products. So we don't make as much as we could. We're making several million gallons a year right now of the neat, and then blending that with petroleum. And we've been doing it now for a few years. Because of the technology we have, without actually manipulating the diesel molecule and just simply putting it up, boiling it up a tower and distilling out the two products, approximately 15 to 20% of our production can be jet, and is. That's what we're doing today, because our cost of production is the same at that 15 to 20% range. The exciting thing for us is the project I just mentioned a few moments ago of expanding our capacity is going to take us from 40 million up to about 350 million gallons in the next 2 years. And about 20% of that, without any effort, again, will be aviation fuel. And so we're going to, especially with things like LCFS, we're going to be introducing significantly more product into the commercial markets over the next couple of years. So having said that, so that's, call that 60 million gallons in 2 years at cost parity, with the capability of making 150 million gallons in 2 years if policy moves in the right direction.
So Tim mentioned that his product was from inedible corn that starts the process. What is the starting of your?
So we use inedible animal fats, greases, and vegetable oils. So mostly these are byproducts from the food industry in general is what we're utilizing. And sort of the aha moment for me when thinking about this is these are the precursors to petroleum. So the majority of petroleum was mostly like an algal oil, so a vegetable oil essentially. What our process does, and I think we might have a slide, I don't know if...
Oh, next one? Sure. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
So essentially what our process is doing is it's replicating what Mother Nature does. We just do it in a matter of moments instead of a million years. We're taking those veg oils or animal fats and greases, and we're taking out the metals and the oxygen associated with those molecules. And once we've done that in our process, that's our first step, it then looks like a molecule that's similar to petroleum facilities, refineries. And so we're actually very efficient in terms of repurposing existing petroleum assets into renewable production. So we add some technology on the very front end to do that deoxygenation and demetallization, and then we utilize existing infrastructure, the rest of the actual conversion process, the towers, the tanks, the pipes, all the rest of it. So as a result, we're able to do these conversions quite quickly and quite cost effectively. So it's really a slight twist on existing technology that's been around for over 50 years.
And both Tim and Brian, if people wanted a copy of your slides that illustrates for dummies how it works, is that okay that we provide it to them?
Absolutely. I'd like to address a question that was asked earlier just quickly also with regard to municipal solid waste. So again, we have multiple technologies, and that's really critical that we have folks like GEVO and others that are looking at this. I think the answer that was given earlier was specific to the GEVO process and some others on the organics. There is another technology or another path in terms of gasifying these municipal solid wastes. There are a couple companies out there that are looking at doing this, Red Rocks, Fulcrum, using a Fischer-Tropsch technology that are going to create what I would refer to as a green crude. What's exciting for us is while they're working on converting that waste into a green crude, it's still, that path anyway, still has to go through a hydrotreating step. So that green crude could come to our facility and we can convert it ultimately into the hydrocarbons. So there is today a technical pathway and ASTM pathways to be able to do that and take municipal solid waste straight through to aviation fuel.
Leo, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question for Brian. Regarding your current production in Paramount, how much of that SAJF production is already being accounted for by the airlines?
So the question is how much of the production by World Energy is accounted for by the airlines?
Are you asking how much could be available for general aviation, or?
No, I'm curious to know if, is it 80%, 85%, 50% of your current production is already accounted for and is already destined for airlines, whether it's, and I don't want to know the airlines, I'm just curious.
Sure. So of our actual production today, I would say it's right around 10% is actually going, maybe a little less than 10% today is actually going into aviation. And again, it's taken real leadership from some commercial aviation partners of ours, some general aviation, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to offset that differential in value. LCFS will take us a long way in allowing us to increase our production into aviation, and we're already in discussions with folks, existing customers who want more and new customers. So it's really an exciting moment. The LCFS, to the question earlier, was a really big change this year, and you're going to see a lot more activity this year. I also believe Neste has made announcements that they're going to actually take some of their production capability and actually put it into commerce, I hope, this year. So you should see a lot more activity this year in general.
I guess my question, maybe I didn't phrase it properly. I guess my question is, of that 10% then, how much is that already being dedicated and accounted for by airlines?
So I have committed probably 3/4 of it in what I'll call term contracts, right? So longer term relationships. And I always keep a piece of it to be able to work with folks who have interesting projects. There's far more demand, believe it or not, than we have supply, even at the price points that we're offering. And we're very transparent. I'll just state from a price perspective, on aviation, the way we price our product is we're very transparent in terms of the additional cost of our product relative to diesel, and we'll show that transparently to customers. And that's all we're trying to overcome. We're not trying to make an extra margin because there isn't other product available. And as that differential comes down, that value accrues back to our customers. So the answer is most of it's committed, but I have enough that we can continue to do interesting projects.
Thank you. Yeah. The gentleman behind Jurgen, you, white shirt. Sorry, I don't know your name.
My name is Robert Silk. I write for Travel Weekly. My question is just do we have any figure on the worldwide production of SAJF last year, or maybe that's pretty recent, 2017, anything like that?
Steve, you got that one, right?
Yeah, we do. So worldwide, jets about 87 billion gallons usage, all uses. And in the last couple of years, we've been order of magnitude around 4 or 5 million gallons total production. So very small amount of total worldwide use. The good news is that Brian alluded to it, all this commercial activity that's going on behind the scenes. We have 250 million gallons per year of offtake agreements already in place on the commercial side for the next several production facilities that are expected to come online, including Fulcrum in Reno, Red Rock in Oregon, The technology pathway that I was mentioning a few minutes ago, this next one, there's already multiple licenses for that. Neste has already announced their expansion, significant expansion capacity, allowing them to bring very large quantities of jet online. So, yeah, you know, it's part of the challenge I always have is balancing my enthusiasm and everything that we're doing for the industry with the pragmatism. We are at the start of this process. There's no question. Have no doubt about that. The one message that I want to get across is that Brian today is making decisions for what his production slate will look like this year, next year, as well as when he brings his capacity expansion online. And the key element is for the business aviation community to communicate to him, yes, we absolutely are an interested customer, and not just him, and Gevo, and all of the others, because here's the key issue with many of these folks that are in the, and we've got one of my dear friends in the audience who's in this position right now. He's trying to close his financing to get started on the installation of new facilities. He can't close on that financing until he has offtake commitments. So it's a circular issue that we have to deal with. We're handling that fairly well on the commercial side. Now is an excellent opportunity on the business aviation side to have that same level of impact with respect to producers who are looking to commercialize in the next 5 years. So expect pretty significant quantity of production of SAJF in 2022 for sure.
Thank you. Jürgen, you had a question?
Yeah, it goes, it adds to what Steve has just said, but it goes more to Keith and Steve on that side of the table. How, as an industry, and especially on the distribution side, can we come up with a more intelligent way of pooling demand and distributing it in a better way? Give you an example. As in my day job, I'm heading a corporate flight operation. We use about 1 million gallons a year globally, anywhere in the world. So it suits our corporate commitment that I have come up with a strategic plan. Okay, 2020 we want to have 10% of our fuel which we use should be renewable fuel. All right, and then we increase that by 10% points each year. So by the end of the decade we reach 100%. Bold goal. But right now it's a chicken and egg thing. So we ask, where do we get the fuel? The question is, can't we do it like I do it with my home energy, my electricity, where I buy renewable electricity? I don't know what comes out of my outlets, but I pool my demand, or I give my demand into a pool and it gets delivered somewhere. And now, okay, notwithstanding all the credits we want to have for Corsia, whatever market-based measures are there, that's a different point. As an industry, we have to work with that. But first of all, can we pool that in a certain way? And of course, like LCFS and all these things doesn't help. And Charles alluded to that and said if that fuel is then distributed in New Mexico, well, it doesn't help.
I can take a
Go for it, Keith, please.
Take a stab at it. You know, I think there will be a pricing mechanism, book and trade, for example, that will do what you have at your home for your electricity for fuel. But I think it's largely going to be driven by the airlines. And you know, of the 26.5 million gallons that are consumed in the, billion gallons in the United States, you know, just a small fraction of that is business aviation. So it's incumbent upon companies like Avfuel, World Fuel Services, and others to work with potential suppliers and or the large off-takers and airline to see what could be done to add on to their supply chain or incorporate us within that supply chain or have us manage their supply chain in exchange for a component of the production. But I think it's going to happen. It's you know, I think it was alluded to, we're just at the beginning of this. And these new projects that are coming on with all these wonderful technologies will ultimately drive where some of those economics will be. And I think the cool thing about this is that we're now part of the equation. So when San Francisco start thinking about, well, how are they going to get fuel to their airport, you know, suppliers like ourselves are working with them as well to say, hey, there's 70 to 80 other airports that also need this product, and we need to make sure we can deliver it by truck. So think about us, and we might just be that increment that puts them over the financial hurdle. So we have to collectively, as a takeaway, we have to have a voice with these major stakeholders, these investors, these companies that are taking this high risk, because our business is relatively low risk, you know, flying corporate aircraft, and some of the other customers and so forth that we supply. But I see it happening both on the infrastructure side, because the biggest opportunity for suppliers like us is to define how you're going to do the blending of the product, because it's typically not blended in a refinery. Brian is the exception. Without exception, the projects that are on stream that are being constructed now don't have the capability of blending the refined jet with the neat jet at that location to produce, you know, the blended product. So you need to find an intermediate step and or location to blend the product and then make sure that you can get it out to the marketplace. So those are the areas of cooperation. One, cooperate with the airlines to pool the demand, cooperate with the infrastructure to pool the demand, and allow the infrastructure to support our specific requirements, which are different than an airline's for pipelines and so on and so forth. It's 95% truck.
So Steve Jamal.
Keith, the only thing I would add to that, and I think you touched on everything very well, is that, look, if you look at the size of the overall network between AvFuel and World Fuel Services, if we address the issues that Keith just spoke about, look, we have the infrastructure in place, we have the technical teams, the distribution network to get that done, but I think, you know, if we focus on what Keith just said, I think by natural, you know, those things would slowly start to occur out there in the market. So I don't believe there's any necessarily hurdles purely from the expertise that we would need on the distribution side to push that, but if we address the issues Keith spoke about, I think we'll be in good shape.
Yeah, Steve Zonka and then Brian.
And I'll just add to that. It's actually can be, that model of working with suppliers like this can be a boon to some of these guys who are in commercialization right now, right? One customer who's off taking all of their fuel, is handling all the logistics, et cetera, all they have to do is focus on the development of the facility, get it up and operating, and focus on the economics of the facility, continue to come down learning curves. So this model actually can be huge, and I already know that it is, because the guys at the end of the table are working with several producers and offering that value proposition. So I think it's actually conducive with this industry. If you've got those kinds of guys who have the relationships into the business aviation community with the FBOs, et cetera, it's kind of a naturally perpetuating activity to some degree.
Brian?
Yeah, first of all, it's a great question and an important question, and really to the core of what World Energy does, and I'd like to address it in terms of things that can be done to pool. So World Energy, first and foremost, is a supplier of low-carbon solutions to our customers. And today, we happen to be concentrated on, we've got 7 different refineries across North America, and we're mostly providing solutions on the transportation side of things, both on the ground transportation and the aviation side. But we work not just in selling our own production. We work on, again, identifying customers, identifying their needs, and delivering to them the most economic, most efficient solutions to achieve their goals. And sometimes that's actually swapping some of our product with some of our friends in our industry to be able to deliver that solution to our customer. And we look forward to more aviation production happening elsewhere so we can continue to do these swaps with other companies. Along the way, though, and an important program that we'll be announcing and talking about more later in this year is actually a corporate program where we'll be collectively putting several corporations together and aggregating that demand for sustainable solutions and figuring out and driving those solutions to those corporates. And, you know, those corporates or those customers sometimes are driven by policy. They have to comply with regulations, or they're being pulled by their own customers because their customers are demanding that they deliver sustainable low-carbon solutions as well. And so as we aggregate all of that demand and the money associated with that, we can offset some of these inefficiencies by lumping that together and creating those efficiencies. So we'll be talking a little bit more. There are examples. There are corporate programs that have been put together either in the commercial aviation side or other areas where it's had proven success. By working with, again, industry companies like Nike, or global consulting firms that use a lot of aviation, trying to figure out those solutions, putting that buying power together and concentrating it into the solutions is a really important piece of the puzzle. So it was a great, insightful question.
Yeah, thank you. So just shifting gears a little bit, so we have Gulfstream and Bombardier that have been using the World Energy products now. So if the two of you could share a little bit about your experience in using the product. So Charles, if you want to go first, that'd be great.
Hope you can hear me now. So I'll add, I mentioned a couple of words earlier. That was, stewardship for the environment, and here we're here to educate. I'll add one more word to that, and that's proactive. And we're really trying to be proactive. Gulfstream is trying to be proactive and take those first steps. They're small steps in the global context, but these are important steps. So I'll tell you our story. Our story started in 2008, and I think Brian kind of mentioned the DARPA, that when the Department of Defense began certification of all of its aircraft, and they came to Gulfstream and said, hey, we'd like to look at your Gulfstream, the military side of that, and what can you do to help us and put together a flight test plan, and how much would it cost, et cetera. So that was kind of the genesis of this. And in 2009, we got more active in renewable fuels. I use the term renewable fuels. I've been using it so long, I struggle with SAJF sometimes, so I'll try to stick to that. In 2011, the G450 became the first aircraft to make a transatlantic flight on renewable fuel, and it was a fuel from Mr. Shivercow here. So it was blended 50-50, not the 3070 that we use today. It was a 50-50 fuel. It wasn't quite certified yet, but it was just about to be certified. And it can be blended up to 50-50. And on that flight, they had actually separated the fuel just to see what the differences are. And so on one engine operated on a 50-50 blend, and on the other engine it was traditional jet fuel. And of course you see there is an energy improvement on the right side, or on the side of the 50-50, and so you're using less fuel on a particular flight. It's more energy content, so you use less fuel. In 2012, we flew the entire in-production fleet to a major air show, NBAA, down in Florida on renewable fuels. By that time, we had the certified fuel we were using. So we asked ourselves, kind of what's next? We've done some demo flights. In 2013, we started initiating discussions with refineries. We were ready, pretty well ready to sign an agreement if it was available. The fuel was not really available at that point. We had some criteria for it, including sustainability requirements, which we had in the contract, which must meet something like an RSB, which is a Roundtable for Sustainable Biomaterials. And that's a third party who double checks, makes sure everything it meets the criteria for sustainability. So that was in the contract to make sure that was there. In 2015, we picked a supplier. It's Altair at the time, now World Energy. Signed a 3-year agreement for that. That first fuel came in 2016, April of 2016, and we started flying all of our products on that, including our recently certified G500. Flew on the renewable fuels and continues to do so during the flight test program. The corporate flights that we have, whenever we can, we're using the renewable fuels, and regular use by our fast airplanes, that's field and airborne services team. So we use it as much as we can in Savannah, and as I said, including the newest technology, which is our G500. As of today, we've used over 436,000 gallons of the blended fuel, 3070 blended fuel. We've flown over 7,000 nautical miles, and probably saved somewhere upwards of 750 metric tons of CO2. City pair records, speed records, we've flew actually 3 now. With our flight yesterday from Savannah to here at Van Nuys on renewable fuel. So we have 3 city pair records just to show that the performance is no loss in performance. That one was in 2017. That was a G650 from New Jersey to Tokyo. In May of 2018, it was a G600 from Savannah to Geneva. And then yesterday, from Savannah to Van Nuys, set a city pair record of 4 hours and 49 minutes, if I got that right, over 2,243 nautical miles and Mach 0.85 on average, with a 76 knot headwind. So on the sustainability side, I think it's been mentioned already that you know, it's important to look at the life cycle analysis, and the fuel, Brian, I think is at least 60% on savings in terms of CO2, so that's really a positive. I guess the last couple of bullets here would be that we will be offering renewable fuel at our Long Beach facility in the next couple of quarters here, probably next quarter or two, maybe middle of the summer. And we continue to look, and Steve talked about next generation fuels, so Gulfstream stays very interested in next generation fuels, and certainly welcome an East Coast supplier to be somewhere as well as the West Coast.
Thanks, Charles. So Brad, David has been at the forefront of pushing the industry to come together to say, hey, refiners, give it to us. Could you a little bit share about Bombardier's experience?
Here, with respect to the East Coast supplier, Charles, we're in the same position. So, you know, we dipped our toe in the water joining Steve's organization in 2006. Again, because of our commercial aircraft division, we were in pretty early as it relates to understanding or contributing to the solution with respect to SAJF. So working with Steve's team 2006 with CAFE, and that was really back when this was a chemistry project, wasn't it? And then our first flight was 2011. That was actually a Dash 8. So it was a Horizon flight, actually, so a Dash 8 Horizon aircraft was our first flight. And then in 2012, we flew with paying passengers on a Dash 8. It was a Porter flight. And today, from a business aircraft perspective, we're really focused on the promotional aspect. So anytime that we can fly to a major event, a major trade show, we always fill up our Learjet Challenger and Globals with SAJF. We do regular buys, so there's a minimum buy. We buy the fuel when we need it. We store it at our facility in Hartford, and we top up the tanks with SAJF when we're flying to a big event. One other thing I wanted to say, Tim, as I guess we're getting closer to a wrap up here.
Yeah.
You know, the good news is, in Pete, you talked about the famous model where we're actually tracking how much fuel is being burnt by the business aircraft division, by the business aircraft industry. And that is a complex model, right, Pete? Because you've got to look at the utilization, you've got to look at every single type, you've got to look at every single type across the 20,000 airplanes, understand how much fuel they burn. As we're tracking that, we are on plan. The challenge that we have, Tim, is that we're on plan because we've actually delivered less aircraft than we thought we would have, standing in 2009 and looking forward. The technological advancements pillar, looking at the engines, looking at aerodynamic improvements, a 2% efficiency a year, it's on track. All fuels is a little bit behind where we would like to have been. So it's great to be here today and just see, like you said, it feels like a snowball rolling down a hill. It's you can feel the acceleration in the room. So really happy to be here. Thanks, Tim.
Great. So we, although we started late, we've got 4 minutes left for questions. Yes, Luceno, please.
The two gentlemen from Gulfstream and Bombardier, just curious if after operating the aircraft with the new fuel, did you conduct a borescope, and if so, what did the borescope tell you, and did you see differences? Sounds like between the two of you, you ran Rolls-Royce engines, Pratt, and a Honeywell engine, and just curious of what borescope results may have revealed, if anything, in those particular power plants.
I can say that we have not done it, as far as to my knowledge, we haven't done borescopes on it, but I think there have been flights where they have done that. They've run the renewable fuels through it, and they've checked for those kind of things. And I can also say that we have no performance loss. There's no problems at all using this fuel. We have operators conferences every 2 years, and I've spoken at the conferences. We almost got 3 years of operations on it now. There's really no problem at all. It's Jet A fully. And actually, it makes Jet A better, by the way. When you blend it, there are properties that lower aromatics for the environment. The energy content is greater, so it's actually making it a better fuel.
And while we go to the next questioner, there have been a couple things done, but the important thing to think about is, because I get that question a lot, people want to know, let's show me hard proof, right? What actually goes on before the fuel is qualified by the industry, before we get that ASTM annex, that kind of activity is going on at each of the OEMs to some degree or another. Some individual components are torn down, you know, following tests, et cetera. And then in the early years, Lufthansa did a pretty significant trial, dedicated city pair, dedicated airplane, dedicated fuel on one side, or SAJF on one side and fuel on the other. And they did do teardowns and pretty detailed inspections afterward, and that information is available in the technical report if you're interested. But we weren't, I mean, that was like no surprise to those of us in the industry who have been working in the background this whole time to establish this framework for creating drop-in fuels in the first place. The only surprise in the Lufthansa thing is the fuel is actually cleaner, as Charles mentioned, and they found some of the components to actually be cleaner than those that are using jet fuel. And I'll throw one more thing out there that hasn't been discussed today, but to the VNY gentlemen, we'll be out with more technical reports this year that also substantiate the reduction in tailpipe emissions when these fuels are used. So the synthetic components that we've talked about, there's no sulfur in any of that fuel. So we automatically get a reduction in PM because there's no SOx. We get a reduction in unburned hydrocarbons, CO, and NOx, and we'll quantify what those things are. And we're looking at those attributes to also help the value proposition of using these fuels in the airport environment, because some airports are very sensitive to those issues, especially airports in non-attainment zones.
Just to add just quickly to that point, it's very, in particular in California, environmental justice has become a very big issue. And, you know, we talked about earlier, you know, the emissions when you put them into an aircraft, obviously it takes off and it leaves the jurisdiction where it necessarily took off. However, it does have a very significant impact environmentally on takeoff and landing, where you have a disproportionate amount of emissions taking place. To what Steve's talking about, by having the criteria emissions be decreased with the use of these fuels is very significant to the communities in which we have our airports, which often can be disadvantaged relative to other areas.
So said another way, the local air quality is improved by it.
David?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is, before we issued the user guide, this was a fundamental requirement. We had to make sure that before we published this, we were absolutely certain, and we did work analytically with all the OEMs, all the airframers, all the engine manufacturers, APU, and system providers. We did a matrix across every aircraft that was currently in production. We had buy-in from all the OEMs, from their technical staff, and we made sure that was the case because of that exact question. So if somebody who buys a $10 million to a $70 million asset, am I going to be okay? And the user guide was specifically put out to make sure we address those wholeheartedly. So that's why this user guide becomes so important, is to, you know, dispel the misnomers that are out there about any concerns there might be about SAJF.
So thank you. So with that said, we have in your media packet that you have there, you have issues, fact sheets that are done both by World Fuel and Avfuel there, as well as information from Bombardier and Gulfstream as well. So take a look at that. Also, we have many of these sustainable alternative jet fuel guides available. And if you want some, we will give them to you to distribute. This is important. This is the first step. And I want to thank you for being part of this historic event and us coming together as a community to make a difference. But first of all, that was the fastest hour 40 panel I've ever done. So I want to thank these panelists. That was awesome. Thank you. And with that said, I'm sure many of you have to go to the bathroom, so the bathrooms are in the hallway, and then we're going to start with lunch. So thank you all.